I help developers level up their Python skills. I do that in two ways. So I run a weekly Python skill building service called Python Morsels. A lot of you have probably found stickers for this around the venue. I also do on-site training for teams to help them level up their Python skills. I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I've learned while doing that second thing, while doing training with teams. I'm also going to be drawing actually pretty heavily from experience that I had before I was ever doing training, coaching at programming workshops. Some of those include Django Girls workshops. So I've coached at a couple of Django Girls workshops, and I've also meta-coached and acted as kind of a coach's coach, in a sense, at some Django Girls workshops in San Diego that I've helped organize. When it comes to coaching, mentoring, teaching, this whole kind of area of topics, I often don't really feel like I know what I'm doing. But I do feel like I'm qualified enough to talk about some of the things that I've learned through this process. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. So show of hands, who's coached at a Django Girls workshop before? Who's coached at any other programming workshop, including a Django Girls workshop? Keep your hands up. Who has sat next to someone at work, maybe a new hire, and helped them with their code? All right, so that was a lot more hands. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands, I'm hoping in the future you can, if you end up in a similar situation where you're sitting next to someone helping them with their code, you may find this talk useful. So we're going to talk about a very specific scenario. You are sitting next to someone and they need your help with their code. But they don't just want you to fix their code, they want you to help them improve their coding skills. So this relationship that you have here with this person, it might be a longer-term relationship. We're going to assume this might be a relationship, though. We're going to be focused on the in-the-moment relationship we have right now. Something I won't be talking about is Python. I'm not going to be talking about Python or programming. This is the first talk, in fact, that I've given where there will be no code on the slides, which is kind of weird for me because that's the thing I usually teach. But that's what we're talking about. So I am going to be talking a little bit about teaching itself, kind of teaching learning theory, but really not very much. And as odd as it might sound, this talk, it's called Meaningful Mentoring Moments. I'm not really going to talk about mentoring. What I am going to be talking about is something that is related to mentoring. Some people call mentoring. So mentoring in the way that some folks use the term, Kim Creighton, for example, gives a lot of talks on mentoring. It's a big picture, longer-term relationship. You're not necessarily just talking about code. You're talking about goals in a bigger sense of the word. We're going to be focused instead on something that's smaller picture. We're focused on helping in the moment. So really, this is more like coaching, which is what Django Girls actually calls this in their curriculum. So there are three big topics that I want to discuss. The first one is being an ally in learning. So when you're coaching someone, I don't want you to be an expert. I want you to be an ally because you're not the star of the show. You are a side character here. Your job is to support and guide the person who you are helping through this learning process. They shouldn't be dependent upon you. The process is centered on them, not on you. So I often live code when I teach. And when I live code, I'm always tempted to write out some code and then explain what that code is doing. That is not teaching. That's telling. I don't want you to teach. Sorry, I don't want you to tell. I do want you to teach. So you can do this. You can focus on teaching and not on telling by actively encouraging active recall. So that's the idea that you're retrieving something from your head. You're retrieving information that might be in your head already from it. We don't learn by putting information into our heads. We learn by trying to take information out of our heads, by trying to retrieve information from our heads. It's not putting it in that's the learning process, it's taking it out. So who has heard the phrase, you learn by doing? So you learn by doing, that everyone's heard this phrase before. It's true, you learn by doing, but the reason we learn by doing is we're retrieving. It's the act of retrieval that's the process of doing. Now, the tricky thing here is that the doing is the hard part. That's the most intimidating part when you don't know what you're doing. But that's the way you learn. The way you learn is doing this intimidating thing, which is the doing. So you can help your learner by encouraging them to make mistakes. So making mistakes, it involves a process of considering what might be a correct answer, what isn't a correct answer, and trying it out. You're failing, you're trying again, you're failing, you're trying again. This is a learning process. Now, I don't just want you to set aside a space where making mistakes is okay. I want you to actively encourage making mistakes. So what I mean by this is you could, for example, say, when asked a question, I don't know, give it a try. You're basically saying here, let's make a mistake together. I don't know what we're doing, but let's make a mistake. Or, what have you tried so far? Which is another way of saying, what mistakes have you tried up to this point? What have you done that didn't work? So I want you to actively encourage your learners to make mistakes. After you've made mistakes, maybe you've made mistakes together, they will find themselves stuck at some point, inevitably. At that point, I want you to not answer any questions. I'm kidding, you actually do need to answer questions. Answering questions is important. This is a learning process. You need to facilitate learning. I do want you to be careful, though, when you're answering questions, you're going to need to remember that you shouldn't be telling, you should be teaching. So you don't want to just give all of the answers in this process. So when you answer questions, you want your answers to be sticky. So you could make an analogy, for example. Analogies are really sticky. Bad analogies especially can be very sticky. Memorable moments are sticky moments. So for example, if you came up with a dance that demonstrates the way dictionaries work in Python, I don't know what that dance would look like. I'm not going to do it because I don't know what it would be, but if you had a dance like that, you could do that dance. It would be a memorable moment probably. It would be sticky. So make your answers sticky. And when possible, when you're giving answers, it's nice to actually avoid being the source of the information, to not give the answer directly, but to go on a learning adventure together. So you can do that by pointing your learner in the right direction, by delegating to the documentation, looking something up together, or more realistically, delegating to Google. So if you're sitting next to someone, who you are coaching, and they ask, why am I getting this error message? Instead of saying, I know the answer to this, you could say, let's look it up together. You might know the answer, but looking up the answer in another source of information is a good idea because you are a resource, you're not the only resource. You want to delegate to resources that are available at 2 in the morning or over the weekend when probably you don't want your learner to call you and use your time. So making mistakes together is important, looking things up together is important. Sometimes you really just need to talk things out though, to talk through a problem together. When you're walking through a problem together, I want you to take some inspiration from a friend of mine. This friend here, or actually these friends here are fine too. Also these ones. These ones are good as well, and so are these. Any of these are great. Who's heard of rubber duck debugging before? So rubber duck debugging, that's actually quite a few of you. What this is the idea that if you get stuck on a programming problem, you talk to your rubber duck. Your rubber duck doesn't talk back, at least hopefully it doesn't talk back. It's not supposed to. It doesn't know the answer. You're talking through the problem with your rubber duck to try to uncover things that you hadn't thought of yet. You're elaborating with your rubber duck. So I want you to not be silent like a rubber duck, but I want you to do a lot more listening. So for example, if your learner says, my code doesn't work, you could ask what they expect the code to do and what it does instead. When they tell you that, you could then ask them to let you know what the approach that they're taking is, to talk more through the problem with you. So less talking, more listening on your part. Elaboration is a really great way to learn. That's what rubber duck debugging is really about, and you can help them with elaboration by kind of being a rubber duck in a way. So teach, don't tell. Actively encourage making mistakes and try to act sort of like a rubber duck, maybe a Socratic rubber duck. You're going to be encouraging questions. You're going to be listening, but you're not going to be speaking so much there. And delegate to other sources of information because you are not the star of the show. The spotlight shouldn't be on you. Your learner is the star of the show here. So being a learning ally is important, but this is not just an intellectual pursuit. Learning is not just an intellectual pursuit, it's an emotional experience. It's going to be emotional for your learner. It maybe will be emotional for you as well. Who remembers learning a new technology and you felt completely and totally lost? Yeah, so that's pretty much everybody. So your learner is going to be living that moment. Maybe not all the time, but probably a lot of the time. This is going to be a vulnerable experience for them because they're going to be displaying their lack of knowledge to you all the time if you're doing your job right. So it's important to build trust with your learner. Your learner needs to feel comfortable being vulnerable with you. They need to trust you. One big way to build trust is to be vulnerable yourself. So there are a lot of ways to make yourself more vulnerable, to kind of remove a bit of that automatic power balance between you and the person you're mentoring there. For example, I make bad jokes. They're not usually funny. I mean, that's usually why they're bad jokes, is they're not funny. But they make me more vulnerable because I'm making a joke that isn't very funny, and it kind of puts me on the spot there. I also make mistakes. Sometimes I make them on purpose. A lot of times I make them on accident as well, partly because I'm live coding, and you always make mistakes while you're doing that. When I make a mistake, though, even if it's on purpose, I never say, I did that to test you. Because why would I say that? I want my learners to feel my fallibility. That makes me a little bit more vulnerable. It helps them more than telling them that I'm doing it to test them would. Another big way to be vulnerable is to say, I don't know. So, for example, you can say, I don't know, let's try it out. Or, I'm not sure, let's look it up together. Delegating to other sources of information is great. Saying, I don't know, is important for building trust. So these are 3 ways to be more vulnerable. They're not the only ways, and being vulnerable is not also the only way to be more trusted. There are other ways to build trust. Another big factor in being trusted is considering the way that you speak. So here are 4 ways to ask almost the same thing. What does this do? What will happen when we run this? What do you think will happen when we run this? And what do you think will happen when we run this? What's your guess? These are very subtly different. We're asking the same question 4 different ways. Which of these do you think is the most welcoming? What's your guess? So I would say that last one is probably the most welcoming. The first 2 actually feel kind of like a pop quiz to me. You want to encourage active recall. You do want to quiz your learners. You don't want them to feel like they're being quizzed, though. There's no reason to add an intimidation factor. You want to invite your learners to guess and to make mistakes. Confident and assertive language has its place, but welcoming language is usually more appropriate when you're trying to coax answers out of people, when you're trying to encourage guessing. So I want you to think less about what you're saying and more about how you're saying it, how what you're saying might be actually heard. I want you to be encouraging while you speak. So there are a lot of ways to alienate your learner in big ways and small ways, kind of inadvertently. A lot of this is really in the way that you phrase things. So obviously, many things are not obvious when you're learning. In fact, probably the things that you're talking about are mostly that, the subject is not obvious there. Of course, this one's a little bit more subtle. When you're new to something, there are rarely of course situations. There's just not many of them. You'll get there at some point, but you're still learning. Oh, it's easy, you just. If it were easy, you wouldn't be doing it. You wouldn't be focusing on this learning moment. Something that's easy for you is not necessarily easy for your learner. What's in your head is not in the head of the person who you're mentoring there. So this next slide here, I think, is the scariest one in my talk. If you don't believe in your learner's ability to improve themselves, they're less likely to improve their own skills. Who has heard of the growth mindset before? So the growth mindset, the idea with this is if you adopt a growth mindset, you believe that through directed effort, you can improve your own skills. So your skills aren't fixed, they're expandable. If you adopt a growth mindset, you are more likely to grow your own skills. Believing that you can is something that actually makes it easier to, in fact, grow your skills. It is hard to believe in your own abilities if the person who's mentoring you or coaching you doesn't seem to believe in your abilities. So you need to You need to give the person who you're mentoring, you're coaching, the impression, either explicitly or at least implicitly, the idea that you believe in them, that you believe in their ability to grow their own skills. So building trust involves being vulnerable, speaking deliberately, which involves making sure that you are encouraging and not alienating the person who you're working with, and believing in the ability that your learner has to learn, believing in their potential and their capacity to grow themselves. So to recap, you want to be a learning ally, not an expert. You don't want to be seen as the star of the show here. You also want to build trust with the person who you're mentoring. You want them to be more comfortable in being vulnerable with you. The last thing that I want to talk about is a way for you to improve your abilities, your mentoring abilities, as you go by kind of learning from yourself. The last thing that I'd like you to do is slow down. So I want you to slow down your thinking. I want you to slow down your speaking. I want you to slow down your actions, especially when you're in a situation where you're not quite sure how to act. Let's say your learner says, my code doesn't work. They show you their code, and you notice pretty quickly 4 things in their code. You notice a function that is improperly named. You notice code that's a little bit ugly, but it does work. You notice something that seems like a logical error, maybe a misunderstanding of the actual problem that you're solving. And you also notice a syntax error, something that's stopping the code from running at all. Which one of these do you focus on first? What do you think? So some of you are guessing here. This is kind of a trick question, actually. It's a trick question because you want to focus on the one that's hanging up your learner, which could vary. Now, probably that second thing is probably not hanging up your learner. If they have these 4 problems, they're probably not asking about code style. In fact, code style is often something you can just leave for another day. Talk about it at some point, but if you've got these 4 problems, this is not your top concern at all. Now, if it's not on code style, the thing that might be hanging them up that's most likely is probably that syntax error. That's probably the thing they're going to notice first because Python notices it first, so they're going to notice it, and then they're going to ask you about it. So the most important thing right now is the thing that you should focus on. You talk about the thing that's important in the moment, and then stop. You stop, and you wait. And at some point in the future, maybe you'll get asked questions about other things. You can have discussions there. You don't want to rush, though. You want to slow down. You're going to be better at knowing what to do next, what thing you should be focusing on next, if you can empathize with your learner, what they might be feeling. I want you to slow down and reflect. So when you speak, question what it is you're saying, why you're saying it, and how that might actually be heard, how your learner might be perceiving that. Now, reflecting on your actions in the moment can be really distracting. I don't want you to get hung up on constantly analyzing yourself and what it is that you're doing. But I do want you to find a way to kind of carve out some space every once in a while to kind of marinate on the moment that you've got and think about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, what you've just done, and where you might be going next. Reflection is a really important part of learning, and you are also learning. You're kind of learning together. Another thing that you might want to consider is learning about learning itself. So there are a lot of folks who write about learning best practices the same way that as developers we tend to write about programming best practices. These best practices in learning are useful for you because you're learning, but they're also useful for you to maybe share with the person who is doing the learning, the mentee that you have there. So for example, you can talk about the growth mindset. You can also talk about the fact that you don't learn by putting information into your head, you learn by taking information out of your head. It's that retrieval that is learning. So this discussion about learning, it could just be a moment for you kind of regurgitating ideas that you've learned about learning, but it could also be a lifetime for the person you're working with there. These are very impactful things. If you're getting better at learning, you're also getting better at the skill of programming itself. Fake it until you make it. Who has heard this term before? So I think we've all heard this term. I don't really like this phrase. It sounds kind of weird to me, sort of insincere, demeaning. The connotation, it sounds off to me. There is some truth to this idea, though. Fake it until you make it, it's kind of another way of talking about adopting a growth mindset. So if you slow yourself down and you think, if I were a good mentor, what would I be doing right now? You're faking it. You're acting deliberately, you're pretending, but you're also practicing, which means you're learning. So eventually you won't have to be faking it so much, it won't feel like faking it as much because it'll be a little bit more intuitive. Faking it is a way of growing yourself. So really we're kind of talking about the growth mindset here. Many mental abilities are learned skills. Thoughtfulness is a learned skill. Empathy is a learned skill. Friendliness is something you can learn. I wouldn't have thought of myself as a very friendly people. Some people have told me I am friendly. I think I fake it pretty well a lot of the time. Maybe at this point it's been internalized a little bit. Lots of mental abilities are learned skills. So if you find something in someone else, if you find a trait in someone else and you want it, steal it. You can fake it. You can try to be that thing until eventually you act a little bit more in that way. So I want you to slow yourself down. Slow down your thinking, slow down your acting, slow down your speaking. I want you to take things one step at a time. I don't want you to distract yourself. I don't want you to distract the person who you're working with. Do the one thing that's important right now and then stop. I also want you to learn a little bit about learning itself. It can be useful for you, working more towards your goal of being a better mentor, but it can also be useful for your learner to understand these things. And I want you to adopt a growth mindset, not just for your own sake, but also for your learner's sake. Whatever being a good mentor means to you, you can move yourself in that direction if you put in the right kind of effort to do so. So I've pretty much only scratched the surface here on this topic. There's a lot of other resources on this in a lot of directions you can go in when you're kind of diving into this topic. I will share a URL with you at the end here that has a lot more information on teaching, on coaching, some other talks that have been given in the past on mentoring in a more broad sense as well. Be a learning ally, not an expert. Build trust with your learners so that they'll be more comfortable being vulnerable with you, and slow down and reflect on what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. Thank you.